Hello and welcome to the next Neuroanatomy video. I am Tanya Chamberlain from the Division of Anatomy here at the University of Leeds, and in this video we will be looking at the neuroanatomy of toothache. After this lecture and any necessary further study, you should be able to describe the general features of the pathway conveying pain and temperature information to conscious awareness, explain what is meant by the term somatotopy, indicate the function and trace the route of the spinothalamic pathway, outline the innervation of the teeth, define the terms ganglion and cranial nerve nucleus, describe the trigeminal ganglion and the trigeminal nuclei, locate the spinal tract and the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, and locate the trigeminothalamic tract. Describe the pathway by which pain and temperature information from the head is conveyed to the cerebral cortex. Firstly, let's have an overview of the information from the transmission of the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. So, we have various different pathways which are able to transport information from the periphery to the central nervous system. We are able to convey more complicated information by a pathway called the dorsal column pathway. This includes the ability to interpret discriminative touch, pressure, complex stimuli such as vibration, and something called proprioception, which is the sense that allows us to know where our body parts are without having to look at them. This pathway is very fast and allows us to make snap decisions. We also have a pathway that conveys more simple information from pain, crude touch, and temperature. This is called the spinothalamic pathway. This pathway is much slower, and it makes more sense that it can be slower because the stimulus is very obvious and it doesn't require a great deal of processing. This latter pathway is one we are going to look at more closely today. In order for us to move forward with the spinothalamic pathway, we need to recap the roles of neurons within the nervous system. The neurons have a body and a long axon. The body of the neuron is found within the grey matter of the CNS. So that's the cerebral cortex and the subcortical grey matter of the brain. The bodies of the neurons are also found in the grey matter of the spinal cord. In the peripheral nervous system, those cell bodies of the neurons are found in ganglia. The white matter is made up of axons. The white matter tracts of the cerebrum are displayed on the image on the left, whilst the white matter tracts of the spinal cord can be seen on the right. In the rest of the body, the peripheral nervous system, those axons are visible as nerves. So to summarise, the grey matter and ganglia contain cell bodies and the white matter or nerves contain neuron axons. In the first lecture we had a look at spinal nerves and we determined that there were 31 pairs of segmental spinal nerves numbered according to the order in which they leave the spinal cord, from most superiorly in the cervical cord to most inferiorly the coccygeal. These spinal segments belong to the peripheral nervous system and conduct messages to and from the central nervous system. Within the grey matter of the spinal cord, these segmental spinal nerves synapse with ascending or descending fibres to or from the brain respectively. We are not interested in the descending fibres today. These are conveying information from the brain to the periphery and are called efferent fibres. But first we will take a look at some of the different neurons found within the nervous system. There are a few types of neurons involved in the transmission of signals to the brain. The first one is pseudo-unipolar neurons, which relay messages from the skin and the muscles to the spinal cord. They are the primary neurons responsible for coordinating movement after input from the brain. Bipolar neurons send and receive information from the world, such as the eyes receiving and transmitting the light signal. Multipolar neurons are able to receive impulses from multiple neurons and transmit signals through their axons. A sensory pathway is made up of a 3-neuron chain. First-order neurons take the signal from the periphery to the central nervous system. Their cell bodies are located in ganglia, but they do not synapse with anything in here. The second-order neurons are located within the CNS. This is where the first-order neuron synapses. Their axons cross over at the midline and run to the thalamus. The third order neuron is synapsed by the second order neuron in the thalamus, and it transports the signal to the relevant region of the cerebral cortex. Because we have those segmental spinal nerves, we have predictable patterns in which each of these nerves carries signals. These specific areas are called dermatomes. We have a dermatomal map that is regularly seen as a poster in physician's office, and these maps help us determine the patterns of pain and explain how referred pain from one region of the body can be present in other regions of the body. Dermatome maps are often coloured and labelled to identify a spinal segmental nerve that is innervating the skin at each region. Here we can see the cervical spinal nerves and the areas of the skin innervated by these, followed by the thoracic, the lumbar, and the sacral. Similarly, the face is also patterned, but these are not called dermatomes. The pattern of the facial skin is determined by the three branches of the trigeminal nerve: the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular. Now, to remind you of the cortical location, we have a lateral perspective of the brain on the left and a mid-sagittal view of the brain on the right. The blue areas are in the frontal lobe on something called the prefrontal gyrus. We know that this is the area of the primary motor cortex. And the yellow ones are found on the postcentral gyrus on the parietal lobe, which is the primary somatosensory cortex and the one we are going to be looking at today. On this slide, we will recap the anatomy of the spinal cord. Let's look at the grey matter first. Here we have the dorsal grey horn, the lateral grey horn, which is only present between the levels of T1 and L2 and S2 and S4, and the ventral grey horn. Now moving on to the white tracts, we have the dorsal white columns, the lateral white columns, and the ventral white columns. Lastly, we have the anterior white commissure that will finally become very relevant. Here is a simplified sketch of the spinal cord transection. I'll remove the labels and add a couple of blue blobs. These blobs are called spinothalamic tracts, and they are located within the ventral white column of the spinal cord. Here we have ascending fibres travelling up to the brain. The dorsal root ganglion is also visible on this image, and it is going to house the cell bodies of the sensory neurons of the first order neurons. The first order neuron is a thin, slow fibre that travels in the dorsal rami of the spinal nerve. The receptors of this fibre are located in the skin. As that fibre makes its way into the dorsal grey horn, it synapses with a second order neuron. The axon from that second order neuron then travels anteriorly and crosses over the midline at the anterior white commissure and enters the spinothalamic tract. It is now important to know that potentially these first order fibres may ascend one or two segments before synapsing, but the rest of the pathway will remain the same. Those second order fibres will still cross at the anterior white commissure before ascending up to the brain. These second order fibres are going to ascend in the spinothalamic tract and travel to the thalamus. Let's zoom out and have a look at what this looks like. The first order neuron enters from the periphery to the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, where it reaches the dorsal grey horn and synapses with the second order neuron. This second order neuron then crosses at the anterior white commissure, and the axon enters the spinothalamic tract. It then courses superiorly or ascends until it reaches the thalamus on the contralateral side. That means the opposite side. The second order neuron then synapses with the third order neuron and completes its journey as it synapses in the cortex, in the appropriate region. We have also looked at a somatotropic map and the sensory homunculus that this was related to. This is located on the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. I'll draw in the thalamus now for you to see. Those third order neurons are going to be relayed to the appropriate area of cortex. As we are looking at the spinothalamic tract, these neurons will travel to the superior medial aspect of the cortex and process sensory information from the genitals all the way through to the neck, including the arms and fingers. That covers a general overview of pain transmission from the body, but what about the teeth? Well, the innervation of the face and the teeth comes from the trigeminal nerve. The maxillary nerve gives rise to the posterior superior alveolar nerve, the infraorbital nerve, and the anterior superior alveolar nerve, whilst the mandibular nerve gives rise to the inferior alveolar nerve. Moving backwards, we need to look at the origins of these nerves. These nerves originate at the trigeminal ganglion, which comes from the pons region of the brain. The ganglion houses the sensory bodies of those first-order neurons in our three-chain pathway. Here we can see the trigeminal ganglion a little more in situ. It has three branches: the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular nerve, that exit the cranium through the superior orbital fissure, the foramen rotundum and the foramen ovale respectively. These are all moving forwards towards the face to innervate the teeth and the skin of the face. This is in a very similar pattern to that we saw in the dermatomes of the body. But where do these nerves begin? Well, they begin in the brainstem. And if we look at the image on the right, we can see that the nuclei for the trigeminal nerve run the length of the brainstem. The nuclei are another name for a region of the brain in which all of the nerves travelling to and from that nucleus fulfill a similar role. The motor nuclei are where the motor fibres for the mandibular branch begin, but we won't be giving this much consideration for today. The sensory nuclei are the ones we want, and these can be seen in orange on the diagram. Now we have three sensory nuclei for the trigeminal nerve, and each nucleus has a different collection of sensory fibres according to that role. The most superior of these is the mesencephalic nucleus, followed by the chief or principal nucleus, and finally, the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Don't be fooled though, there are far more many nuclei in the brainstem, but for the sake of simplicity I haven't included these on the image. Now we need to take a closer look at the nuclei. Each nucleus does a different role. The mesencephalic nucleus receives proprioceptive information from the muscles of mastication. This is particularly important for preventing us from biting our tongue when we talk, even if our tongue is numb. This is because it knows whether our mouth is opened or closed. The chief or principal nucleus is the one that receives more complex sensory information, such as vibration or fine touch and two-point discrimination. The spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve is the one that we want today. This is the one that transmits pain and crude touch or temperature. It is divided into two parts. The pain and temperature is located more caudally, so lower in the medulla, and crude touch and pressure is located higher up in the medulla. These are the regions that we will focus on in this video. The first order neuron enters at the trigeminal ganglion, in this case from the mandibular branch, but it could be from any of the three branches. The axons then run caudally in the spinal tract of the trigeminal. They then synapse with the second order neuron within the nucleus of the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. These axons then cross over the midline and ascend in the trigeminothalamic tract and travel towards the thalamus. Once at the thalamus, the second order neurons synapse with third order neurons and travel to the proper area of cortex. Because they have come from the trigeminothalamic tract, they have come from the face, so these third order neurons are travelling to the lateral aspects of the postcentral gyrus. We need to have a look at the effect of medullar lesions on the sensory perception from the body and the face. Here is a transection of the medulla, And let's draw in some of the regions which we have mentioned today. Here we can see the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. This is where first order neurons are going to travel down to the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. We know that the spinal nucleus of cranial nerve 5 is quite long, as is the spinal tract of 5, because these nerves must be able to travel to the most caudal aspects of that nucleus. We can also see that the spinothalamic tract is present. This is conveying information from the body and transporting the messages to the cortex where it can be perceived. Let's say, hypothetically, that we have a lesion here. We can see that there will be two potential sensory impairments. One sensory impairment from the face and one sensory impairment from the body. This is because we are disrupting two pathways. One of those pathways comes from the first order neurons carrying information from the face. The other pathway is the sensory information being carried from the second order neurons of the body. But will those sensory impairments be on the same side? No. We know in the spinothalamic pathway the crossing over of those second order neurons happens in the spinal cord, much lower than in the medulla. So a lesion in the medulla here will affect the contralateral, or opposite side of the body's ability to feel crude touch and pain, as these fibres have crossed over at the midline a long time before they reach this region of the brain. So this spinothalamic tract is carrying over information from the right side of the body. A lesion here will result in contralateral body sensation. In the trigeminothalamic pathway, the fibres cross over at the spinal nucleus. So when we look at this location of this hypothetical lesion, we are compromising the first order neurons still in the spinal tract. So the sensation will come from the ipsilateral or same side of the face. So therefore, a lesion here will result in contralateral body sensation and ipsilateral face sensation changes. Interestingly, neurosurgeons have been able to exploit these different tracts and pathways for the treatment of trigeminal neuralgia. Highly skilled surgeons are able to locate the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve and cut the fibres on the same side of the face. This means that the pain signals from the trigeminal nerve on the same side cannot synapse with second order neurons and transmit the pain. Because we know the location of the nuclei associated with pain around the face is found in the caudal aspects, but other sensory nuclei are still intact, so the tracts for proprioception and discriminative touch are unaffected. This brings us to the end of the video. You should now be able to describe the general features of the pathways conveying pain and temperature information to conscious awareness. Explain what is meant by the term somatotopy. Indicate the function and trace the route of the spinothalamic pathway. Outline the innervation of the teeth. Define the terms ganglion and cranial nerve nucleus. Describe the trigeminal ganglion and the trigeminal nuclei. Locate the spinal tract and spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Locate the trigeminothalamic tract. And describe the pathway by which pain and temperature information from the head is conveyed to the cerebral cortex.